I spent 40 years building a $120,000 nest egg, only to watch it sail away on a luxury boat in the arms of the man I was paying to replace me. I thought I was buying a ticket to paradise, but I was actually financing my own disappearance. And if you think your money buys loyalty in these waters, you're just the next victim in line. Before I show you how my provider ego turned me into a legal ghost in a Manila alleyway, make sure to subscribe to the channel to protect your own future from the traps of the retirement sinkhole. If my $120,000 nightmare can save your future, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more warnings from the front lines of paradise. Don't let your life's work become someone else's harvest. Before I was a ghost in Manila, I was a ghost in Ohio. For 40 years, I was a faceless cog in a logistics firm that didn't care if I lived or died. I sat in a beige cubicle under buzzing fluorescent lights that sucked the color out of my skin. By 65, I was invisible. The younger staff looked through me like I was part of the furniture. I spent my lunch breaks eating lukewarm soup alone, realizing that if I dropped dead, they'd post my job before the paramedics arrived. But the office was nothing compared to the silence at home. My divorce happened a decade earlier, leaving me in a 3-bedroom house that felt like a museum of failed expectations. My ex-wife had remarried, and my adult children were busy, calling only on holidays out of obligation. I spent my evenings in a recliner, the blue TV light reflecting off my glasses as I ate frozen dinners. I was a 67-year-old man in a house of echoes, realizing I had spent my life building a foundation for people who weren't there anymore. I was terrified that this quiet, sterile isolation was all that remained of my time on earth. My existence had become a waiting room for death, a sterile environment where nothing ever changed and no one truly laughed. Every day was a carbon copy. Check the mail, take the blood pressure pills, and watch neighbors mow lawns with mechanical precision. The suburbs felt like a graveyard with better landscaping, a place where old men fade into the gray mist of retirement. I was starving for something that felt like real life, a spark to remind me that I wasn't just waiting for the final curtain. Little did I know, the spark I found would burn my world down. I had scraped together a $120,000 nest egg, but in America, that money was just a safety net for a fall I was already taking. It wasn't enough to live like a king, but it was too much to ignore while I sat in my waiting room. My provider ego started screaming, telling me I deserved to be more than a retired manager with a bad back. I wanted to be a captain, a man of means whose presence actually mattered. I was tired of being invisible, and I convinced myself that my money was the key to being alive. It started at 2 a.m. when desperation and late-night browsing create a dangerous cocktail of hope. I saw an ad for retirement in paradise featuring blue waters and women more beautiful than any I'd ever known. The contrast between those sun-drenched images and the gray, rainy street outside my window was almost physical. I saw a man who looked like me, smiling on a boat, holding the hand of a woman who looked at him like a hero. I didn't know I was looking at a mirage designed to swallow men like me whole. I was wandering through the digital desert of my loneliness when I stumbled upon a shimmering oasis and a saturation-boosted thumbnail. It was a video titled "Retire Like a King for $1,500 a month," and the imagery of turquoise waters and swaying palms felt like a physical rescue from my gray Ohio existence. I sat there in the dark, the laptop glow illuminating a face I no longer recognized, watching men who looked just like me, tired, overlooked, and aging, suddenly reborn as vibrant figures of importance. They spoke of a place where a modest pension bought a lifestyle of luxury and respect. This wasn't just a travel destination. It was a promise that my life was merely waiting for a change in scenery. The logic felt ironclad at the time, a mathematical escape hatch from the looming poverty of a standard American retirement. In Ohio, my $120,000 was a fragile shield against the rising costs of health care and property taxes, a sum that would eventually dwindle into nothingness as I sat in a nursing home waiting for the end. But in the Philippines, that same money was transformed into a kingdom, a way to bypass the slow decay and jump straight into a life of respect. I spent weeks obsessing over cost of living spreadsheets, convinced that I was making the smartest move of my life. I was building a bridge out of my waiting room for death. And for the first time in a decade, I felt the electric hum of genuine hope. Beyond the finances, it was the promise of a culture of care that truly seduced my weary heart. The videos described a world where family values were paramount and where an older man's wisdom and stability were prized above the fleeting youth of a younger partner. I watched countless testimonials of men claiming they had found a level of loyalty and affection that had vanished from the Western world decades ago. To a 67-year-old man who felt like a ghost in his own neighborhood, the idea of being needed, truly, deeply needed, was more intoxicating than any tropical cocktail. I convinced myself that I wasn't just buying a lifestyle, I was investing in a reality where I would never have to eat another frozen dinner in silence again. My destiny was waiting across the ocean. During these feverish nights of research, the idea of the tour boat first began to take shape in my mind, shifting from a vague fantasy to a concrete mission. I didn't just want to sit on the beach. I wanted to be a man of action again, a captain who commanded both a vessel and the respect of his community. I envisioned a sleek boat, a $120,000 monument to my new life that would serve as both a business and a beacon for the woman I would eventually find. My provider ego was fully ignited, telling me that being a business owner in paradise would provide the ultimate security for my future. I had no idea I was sketching the blueprint for my own financial execution. My transition from a spectator to a participant happened on a humid Tuesday when I finally created a profile on a site specifically designed to connect Western men with Filipinas. I was nervous, my fingers hovering over the keyboard like a schoolboy as I scrolled through hundreds of profiles of beautiful women who seemed to be looking for exactly what I was offering. Then I saw her, Maria. With a smile that seemed to bypass my logic and strike directly at the core of my loneliness, her eyes promising a warmth I hadn't felt in 20 years. I spent hours crafting a single message, trying to sound like the confident man I desperately wanted to be. I hit send with a trembling hand, and within seconds, a message bubble popped up that changed my world forever. Stepping off that plane in Manila was like walking into a humid, neon-soaked dream that immediately bleached the gray memories of Ohio right out of my brain. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and diesel, a heavy tropical blanket that seemed to wrap around my weary shoulders and whisper that my life was finally beginning. Maria was standing there in a bright yellow dress that made her skin glow like polished mahogany, holding a handmade sign with my name on it, as if I were a returning war hero rather than a retired logistics manager. When she threw her arms around me, the 40-year age gap vanished in a puff of vanilla-scented perfume, and my provider ego began to swell, convincing me that I wasn't just a tourist, but a man of destiny who had finally found where he belonged. The first few weeks in her province felt like living inside a high-definition travel brochure, where I was the undisputed protagonist of every scene. We stayed in a beautiful resort overlooking the Sulu Sea, and for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't waking up to the sound of an alarm clock or the dull ache of existential dread. Maria treated me with a level of reverence that I hadn't known existed, anticipating my every need before I could even voice it. From the way she peeled my fruit to the gentle way she massaged my tired feet, I felt a surge of vitality that defied my 67 years, a delusional certainty that my money had purchased not just a lifestyle, but a literal fountain of youth. I was no longer the invisible old man in the cubicle. I was a king in a kingdom of turquoise water and constant smiles. In this scripted movie of my new life, Maria was the perfect co-star, performing her role with a dedication that would have put Hollywood to shame. She introduced me to her family as her American prince, and I bask in the reflected glory of their grateful gazes as I handed out small gifts and treated the entire clan to lavish dinners. My provider ego was being fed a gourmet diet of respect and adoration, and I began to view my $120,000 savings not as a finite resource, but as the magical fuel that kept this beautiful engine running. Every sunset we watched together from the shore felt like a personal gift from the universe, a confirmation that my decision to abandon the West was the most brilliant move I had ever made. I was utterly intoxicated by the sensation of being the center of someone's universe, unaware that the stage was already being set for a very different kind of drama. The local community in her coastal town began calling me Sir Kevin, a title that acted like a shot of adrenaline to my self-esteem every time I heard it. I would walk through the local market with Maria on my arm, feeling the envious and respectful stares of the local men, and I truly believed that I had cracked the code to human happiness. I was the quote-unquote American savior, the man who was going to bring prosperity to this sleepy village, and the weight of my wallet felt like a badge of office. I started to lose touch with the reality of who I actually was, a man whose entire value was tied to a bank account, and instead, I began to inhabit the persona of a powerful patriarch. This was the peak of my, quote, love blindness, where the beauty of the scenery masked the absolute lack of legal ground beneath my feet. It was during a particularly breathtaking boat tour of the nearby lagoons that the idea of the $120,000 investment finally solidified into a shimmering, irresistible mission. As we glided over coral reefs that looked like underwater cathedrals, Maria leaned close to me and whispered about how wonderful it would be if we didn't have to rent these subpar vessels from strangers. She spoke of a family legacy, a way to ensure that our future children and her aging parents would always be looked after, long after the initial excitement had faded. My provider ego roared with approval, seeing the tour boat not as a risky business venture, but as a floating monument to my love and my status as a captain of industry. I wanted to be the man who provided the ultimate security, the hero who turned a dream into a multi-decked reality of fiberglass and chrome. Maria's cousin Ramil appeared on the scene around this time, introduced as a master boat builder and navigator who could help me navigate the complex local regulations. He was a young, athletic man with a quick smile and a deferential attitude that immediately put my Western suspicions to rest, as he seemed only interested in helping his Uncle Kevin succeed. We spent hours over cold beers planning the specifications of the vessel, with Ramil drawing blueprints that looked like maps to a treasure I was already holding. I felt like a true entrepreneur, a man of action who was finally building something tangible instead of just shuffling spreadsheets in a windowless office. I was so focused on the technical details of the hull and the engine that I never stopped to wonder why the cousin was so eager to spend every waking hour in our company. The process of transferring the first $40,000 for the initial construction phase felt like a sacred ritual, a concrete proof of my undying trust in the woman who had saved my soul. I remember standing in the local bank, the air conditioning humming as I signed the documents that Maria explained were necessary to keep the business within the legal Filipino-owned framework. She held my hand tightly, her eyes moist with what I thought were tears of gratitude, promising me that this was our bridge to a life of eternal comfort. I didn't care about the fine print or the anti-dummy law that I'd vaguely heard about in expat forums. I only cared about the way she looked at me when I became her financial savior. I was signing away the first third of my life's work, but in that moment, it felt like I was buying a ticket to a paradise that would never end. As the boat began to take shape in the local shipyard, my daily routine became a blissful loop of progress and affection that felt like a permanent vacation. I would spend my mornings supervising the construction with Ramil, feeling the rough wood and the smooth fiberglass, imagining myself at the helm with the wind in my hair. In the afternoons, Maria and I would swim in the hidden coves, our laughter echoing off the limestone cliffs like a soundtrack to a life that was finally, truly right. I felt a sense of belonging that I had never experienced in Ohio, a feeling that I had finally found my quote-unquote tribe and my purpose. I was the quote-unquote captain in waiting, the man who had traded a lonely recliner for a maritime empire, and every day was a masterpiece of romantic fulfillment. The physical intimacy during this period was a powerful drug that kept my critical thinking skills in a state of permanent hibernation. For a man of 67 who had felt like a ghost for a decade, the touch of a young, beautiful woman was a validation that bypassed the brain and went straight to the ego. Maria was a master of the quote-unquote culture of care, making me feel like the most virile and important man on the planet, regardless of the reality reflected in the mirror. I convinced myself that our connection was a rare, transcendental bond that was immune to the cynical rules of the world or the cold statistics of expat failure. I was living in a bubble of pheromones and tropical heat, a retirement plan with a pulse that I guarded with every cent of my dwindling savings. We celebrated the halfway point of the construction with a massive fiesta for the entire village, a $5,000 party that I paid for with a smile that never left my face. I was the guest of honor, sitting at the head of a long table laden with roasted pig and local delicacies, watching Maria dance with a grace that made my heart ache with pride. The village elders toasted my health, and for a few hours, I truly believed I had bought my way into a family that would protect me until my dying breath. My provider ego was at its absolute zenith, convinced that I had built a fortress of loyalty that no legal document could ever rival. I was the benefactor of an entire community, a man whose name was synonymous with generosity and vision in this small corner of the world. Looking back, the scripted movie was reaching its climax, and I was so lost in the performance that I didn't notice the director had already started changing the set behind me. Every cousin who joined the crew, every legal fee that required another wire transfer, and every medical emergency in Maria's family was just another line of dialogue in a play designed to empty my pockets. But at the time, I was too busy practicing my captain's salute and admiring the way the sun hit the bow of my $120,000 dream to notice the shadows lengthening around me. I had achieved the grand finale I had always dreamed of, a life of prestige, passion, and purpose that seemed as solid as the hull of my new vessel. I was the happiest man in the Philippines, a king on a throne of my own making, surrounded by people who I thought would die for me. The honeymoon was a masterpiece of deception, a period of such profound and radiant happiness that it still haunts my dreams in this Manila alleyway. I lived every second of those months as if I had truly beaten the system, as if I were the one man who had actually found the retirement in paradise promised in the late night videos. I was so deeply entrenched in the role of the American savior that I couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't the center of Maria's life. I had built a world out of sand and ego, and I was too busy admiring the view to notice the tide coming in. Looking back, I should have realized that a dream this perfect, this polished, and this expensive was too good to be true. But I didn't want to see the cracks until the entire house was already falling on my head. The high of that village fiesta lasted exactly 3 days before the first hairline fracture appeared in my beautiful $120,000 reservoir of hope. Maria came to me with red-rimmed eyes, clutching a cracked smartphone as if it held a death sentence, explaining that her mother's weak heart had finally buckled under the heat of the province. It was a modest request, just $800 for specialized medicine and a private consultation in the city, a mere drop of water from my massive financial cistern. I didn't hesitate for a second because my provider ego told me that this was my moment to shine, to prove that I wasn't just a rich tourist, but a devoted son-in-law who protected his own. I handed over the cash with a sense of noble satisfaction, telling myself that $800 was a small price to pay for the eternal gratitude of the woman I loved. I started to view my retirement savings not as a fixed sum for my survival, but as a deep, replenishing well designed to wash away the suffering of Maria's entire bloodline. Every time a new emergency bubbled to the surface, I visualized it as a tiny, manageable leak in the dam, something that a man of my means could easily plug with a few crisp $100 bills. I was 67 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a god who could solve any tragedy with the stroke of a pen or a trip to the ATM. I justified each withdrawal as an investment in loyalty, convinced that every dollar I spent was building a wall of obligation that would keep Maria by my side forever. I was so busy playing the role of the benevolent patriarch that I failed to notice how the water level in my reservoir was starting to recede, leaving the dry, jagged rocks of my vulnerability exposed to the sun. The next crack arrived in the form of a frantic midnight phone call regarding her younger brother, who had allegedly crashed his motorbike into a local official's tricycle. Maria was inconsolable, claiming that without $1,500 for settlement fees and repairs, her brother would be cast into a provincial jail where he wouldn't survive the week. My gut gave a tiny anxious twitch, a distant warning bell that I silenced with the sheer weight of my own arrogance. I told myself that family was the cornerstone of Filipino culture, and that by saving her brother, I was securing my place at the head of the table for the rest of my life. I was the American hero, the man with the golden touch, and I viewed the $1,500 not as a loss, but as a necessary tribute to the gods of my new paradise. The atmosphere in our beautiful beachfront cottage began to shift, moving from a dreamlike euphoria to a subtle, vibrating tension that only dissipated when I opened my wallet. I noticed that Maria's smiles were becoming shorter, more transactional, appearing only after I had agreed to fund the latest unexpected hurdle in our path to the boat's completion. If I questioned a cost or asked for a receipt, the culture of care would vanish instantly, replaced by a cold, devastating silence that made me feel like the invisible ghost I was back in Ohio. I was terrified of returning to that gray, lonely existence, so I rationalized her mood swings as cultural stress and provincial pressure, convincing myself that I just needed to be more generous to keep the dream alive. I was paying for the air I breathe, but I called it love because I couldn't afford to call it anything else. Then came the bureaucracy tax, a sudden $3,000 requirement for a special maritime permit that Ramil claimed was the only thing standing between our vessel and the open sea. He sat across from me with a look of practiced concern, explaining that the local Coast Guard needed additional documentation that could only be expedited with a significant cash incentive. My defensive anxiety started to flare, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck as I realized I was pouring money into a black hole of unforeseen legalities. But I looked at the boat, my $120,000 monument to masculinity, and told myself that I couldn't stop now when I was so close to the finish line. I justified the $3,000 as a lubricant for the gears of progress, a standard cost of doing business in a country I still didn't understand. Ramil's needs began to expand alongside the boat's hull as he suddenly required a high-end laptop and specialized GPS equipment to ensure our tours were the best in the province. He was very deferential, calling me captain, with a frequency that acted like a drug on my ego, making it nearly impossible for me to say no to his $2,200 request. I told myself that a modern business required modern tools and that I was simply equipping my staff for the success that would eventually refill my dwindling reservoir. I was investing in the infrastructure of my future, or so I whispered to myself late at night while I stared at my bank balance on the laptop screen. I ignored the fact that Ramil seemed to be spending more time on his new laptop in the back of the boat than he did actually working on the engine. The first time I saw my total savings dip below the $100,000 mark, a wave of genuine panic washed over me, leaving me breathless in the tropical heat. I had spent $20,000 in less than 3 months on emergencies and permits, and the boat wasn't even in the water yet. I tried to bring it up to Maria, but she immediately pivoted to a story about her father's farm, which was supposedly being seized by a local moneylender over a $5,000 debt. She looked at me with such profound performative disappointment, as if my concern for my own survival was a betrayal of our shared future. I felt a crushing sense of guilt, a provider ego backfire that convinced me I was being a selfish, stingy old man for worrying about a few $1,000s when her family's legacy was at stake. The $5,000 for the farm felt like a massive blow to the structural integrity of my financial dam, a wide, jagged hole that let the water pour out in a terrifying torrent. I sat in the bank, my hands shaking as I authorized the transfer, telling myself that once the farm was safe, the request would finally stop. I was buying peace of mind, a commodity that was becoming increasingly expensive and elusive in this sun-drenched nightmare. I justified the expenditure by imagining the gratitude of her parents, convinced that I was now the owner of their loyalty and that they would protect me if things ever went wrong. I was building a fortress of debt and calling it a family, too blinded by the love property paradox to see that I was just a cow being milked until I was dry. Maria's emotional landscape became a minefield where the only safe path was paved with my remaining retirement funds. Every conversation seemed to lead back to a cousin with a broken roof or a nephew who needed tuition, each story crafted with a level of detail that made my skepticism feel like a moral failing. I started to hide my anxiety, putting on a brave face of American prosperity, while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told myself that this was just the startup phase of my new life, and that once the boat was operational, these small leaks would be irrelevant. I was a man of 67, betting my entire existence on the hope that a $120,000 tour boat could outrun the systematic depletion of my soul. The mother's medical emergency escalated into an $8,000 life-saving surgery that Maria claimed was the only thing that would keep her mother alive until our wedding day. The timing was so perfect, it should have been a siren, but I was so deep in the love blindness that I only saw a chance to be the ultimate savior. I felt a sick, twisted pride as I handed over the money, relishing the way Maria threw her arms around me and called me her hero in front of the entire household. I was drowning in my own reservoir, but I was too busy enjoying the view from the surface to realize I was running out of air. I justified the $8,000 as a wedding gift to the family, a way to cement my status as the indispensable pillar of their community. My gut was screaming at me every morning, a visceral, physical rejection of the lies I was telling myself to stay sane in this humid paradise. I would lie awake at night, calculating the remaining balance of my life's work, realizing that my $120,000 fortress was now a shell of its former self. But then Maria would touch my arm in the dark, her warmth reminding me of the cold, sterile bed waiting for me in Ohio, and I would shove the fear back down into the depths of my psyche. I told myself that I had come too far to turn back, and that winners don't quit just because the road gets a little bumpy. I was a captain, and a captain doesn't abandon his ship just because the hull is taking on a little water. The boat was finally ready for its maiden voyage, a shimmering $120,000 dream that had actually cost me closer to $160,000 when the taxes were factored in. I stood on the dock watching the sun hit the polished chrome, feeling a surge of triumph that temporarily silenced every doubt and every warning bell in my head. Maria was standing next to me, her hand in mine, looking at the vessel with a hunger in her eyes that I mistook for pride in our achievement. Ramil was already on board, revving the engines with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, holding a clipboard full of final documents that he said I needed to sign before we could legally take our first paying customers. I reached for the pen, ready to finally become the captain I had paid so much to be, unaware that the most expensive paper of my life was still waiting for my signature. The boat was finally bobbing in the harbor, but Maria told me a captain needs more than just a vessel. He needs a home port, a piece of the earth to anchor his soul. She found a perfect plot of beachfront property adjacent to the docks, a 3-acre slice of heaven that she claimed was being sold at a family discount by a distant uncle. My feverish mind saw it as the final piece of the puzzle, the foundation that would turn my $120,000 maritime dream into a permanent dynasty. I was 67, and the thought of owning paradise made my Ohio cubicle feel like a prehistoric bad dream. My provider ego was humming at a frequency that drowned out the screams of my common sense, telling me that a man of my stature shouldn't just be a tenant in a rented cottage. Maria whispered about our future children running on that sand, about a family compound where we would grow old together, shielded from the cold winds of the world by the walls I would build. I looked at her, so young and vibrant, and I felt a desperate need to bind her to me with something more substantial than just a boat. I wanted to be the architect of her entire reality. The legal reality was a jagged pill that Maria coated in the sweetest honey, explaining with practiced patience that the land could only be registered in her name to satisfy local statutes. She held my hands, her eyes searching mine for any hint of Western cynicism that she claimed had ruined my previous life, promising that her heart was the only deed I would ever truly need. I was a ghost investor in training, voluntarily stepping into a legal void because the alternative, being an old lonely man with a bank account but no purpose, was too terrifying to contemplate. I convinced myself that trust was the ultimate currency. I opened my laptop in the dim light of our terrace, the screen reflecting a face that looked 10 years older than when I'd left Ohio, staring at the remaining $85,000 in my retirement account. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a leap of faith from a financial cliff, a total commitment that would leave me with no safety net and no way back. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm, a cocktail of terror and exhilaration that made my hands shake as I navigated to the wire transfer page. I was betting my entire existence on a woman's promise and a piece of paper. Ramil was standing in the shadows, nodding with that same deferential smile that I now realized was the look of a predator watching a trap spring shut. Maria leaned over my shoulder, the scent of her jasmine perfume clouding my judgment as she pointed at the confirm button, her voice a soft, hypnotic lullaby of our future and our legacy. I felt a strange, detached sense of power. The provider ego giving me one last, lethal surge of adrenaline before the final fall. I was the captain, authorizing the final supplies for a voyage into eternity, believing that wings would grow because I willed them to. I took a deep breath and clicked the button, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen like a slow-motion executioner's blade, as my life's work vanished into the digital ether. $75,000 for the land and permits for the great house that would prove I was the king of this domain. A hollow peace washed over me, the calm that comes when you've let go of the rope and the ground is rushing up to meet you. I looked at Maria for gratitude, but she was already on her phone, her thumb flying across the screen with a sudden, cold urgency. The launch party was supposed to be the coronation of my new life, a $2,000 blowout on the deck of the vessel that had consumed my soul and my savings. I stood there in my crisp white captain's hat, nursing a warm beer and looking for Maria, wanting to share this moment of absolute triumph with the woman who had saved me from my lonely Ohio existence. Ramil was already at the helm, but he wasn't looking at the charts. He was looking at Maria with a proprietary smirk that made the hair on my neck stand up. The music was thumping, a loud, distorted local pop song that felt like it was vibrating inside my skull, signaling a celebration that suddenly felt like a funeral I wasn't invited to attend. Maria approached me not with a kiss, but with a sleek, leather-bound folder and a pen that felt as heavy as a lead pipe in my hand. She whispered that the Coast Guard needed one final signature on a supplemental insurance waiver, a routine formality to ensure our first tour at dawn was fully protected under the local maritime laws. My hand was shaking from the adrenaline and the oppressive tropical heat, but I signed that paper with a flourish of undying trust, believing I was finally securing our future together in paradise. The moment the ink dried, the air seemed to leave the bay, and Maria's face transformed from a mask of devotion into a cold, geometric landscape of pure business. She didn't thank me. She simply snapped the folder shut and handed it to Ramil like a relay baton. The panic hit me like a physical blow when I tried to follow her into the cabin and found the door locked from the inside. The sound of their muffled laughter cutting through the salt air like a serrated blade. I pounded on the fiberglass, my provider ego screaming for an explanation, for the respect I had spent my entire life's work to manufacture in this humid province. A local port official I had bribed months ago stepped out of the shadows of the dock, looking at me with a mixture of pity and bored contempt that made my stomach turn. He didn't call me Sir Kevin or Captain anymore. He just held up a copy of the registry and told me in broken English that I was officially a persona non grata on a vessel I no longer had any legal right to touch. I scrambled off the boat as the engines roared to life, the twin outboards spitting out a plume of black smoke that tasted like the charred remains of my own common sense. I watched from the wooden pier, my breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps as Ramil stepped out of the cockpit and wrapped his arm around Maria's waist in a way that no cousin ever would. They weren't hiding it anymore. The play was over. The American savior had fulfilled his final contractual obligation, and the actors were dropping their costumes right in front of the audience. I saw her lean into him, her head resting on his shoulder, as they looked at the shore, not with love for me, but with the cold satisfaction of two predators who had just finished a very long, very profitable hunt. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from my banking app that felt like a final lethal shot to my solar plexus. I stared at the screen, the bright numbers blurring as I realized the great house funds hadn't gone to an uncle or a deed office. They had been diverted into a private account I would never be able to access. My remaining balance was a mocking 3-digit figure, a $150 pittance that wouldn't even cover a one-way flight back to the gray cubicle and the frozen dinners of my former life. The $120,000 fortress I had built for my dignity had been liquidated in the time it took to sign a supplemental waiver, leaving me standing on a foreign dock with nothing but a plastic hat and a heart full of broken glass. I reached out to grab the railing as the boat began to pull away from the dock, desperate for one last word, one single explanation that would make this sudden nightmare make sense. Maria walked to the stern, looking down at me with eyes that were as flat and empty as the pockets of my cargo shorts. She didn't scream, she didn't apologize, and she didn't offer a single tear for the 2 years of care I had subsidized with my life's blood and every cent of my retirement. She just leaned over the edge, her voice perfectly clear over the idling engines, and said the words that finally turned the lights out on my world. Thank you for the boat, Kevin, but Ramil says you're too old to be on the guest list for our wedding. I watched my $120,000 dream sail away, but the nightmare was just beginning on land. When I trudged back to the great house I'd financed with my last $75,000, I found my suitcases sitting in the dirt outside the locked gate. Ramil's brother stood there with a machete, no longer the smiling nephew who needed tuition, but a cold-eyed sentry guarding a fortress I was never legally allowed to inhabit. They didn't even give me the key to the front door. They simply pointed toward the road and told me that the foreigner's time was over. I was a 67-year-old man standing in the mud. The market where I was once hailed as Sir Kevin now felt like a gauntlet of mocking whispers and averted eyes. The culture of care had evaporated along with my bank balance, leaving behind a harsh, transactional landscape where I was nothing more than a used-up ATM. I saw the local officials I had lubricated with thousands of dollars turning their backs as I passed, their respect having been a lease that expired the moment my wire transfers stopped. I wasn't a captain or a prince anymore. I was just another ghost investor who had outlived his usefulness to the tribe and the local economy. I spent my first night as a pauper huddled under a corrugated metal lean-to, clutching my backpack like a life raft in a sea of indifference. I am the survivor of a $120,000 shipwreck, washed up on a beach that I once thought I owned, watching the wreckage of my dignity bobbing in the distance. Every cent of my 40 years of labor in Ohio has been swallowed by the retirement sinkhole, leaving me with exactly $150 and a body that feels like it's made of lead. The provider ego that once made me feel like a god now feels like a lethal parasite. The journey back to Manila was a blur of cramped buses and the soul-crushing weight of my own stupidity. I had to sell my watch and my laptop just to afford the fare and a few days of cheap rice, moving through the city like a shadow among the vibrant world. I saw other older Western men walking with young women, and I wanted to scream a warning that would shatter their delusions, but I knew they wouldn't listen any more than I had. I was a 67-year-old ghost haunted by the memory of a yellow dress and a family legacy that was just a harvest. Standing in the airport terminal, the sterile air conditioning feels like a refrigerated morgue compared to the jasmine-scented promise of my arrival. If you're 67 and dreaming of a tropical grand finale, look at my empty hands and stay in the West where the law actually knows your name. Never put your life's work in a name that isn't yours, because in paradise, a captain without a deed is just a ghost waiting to be exorcised. Don't be like me, heading back to a cold house with nothing but regret. Your provider ego is the rope they will use to hang you. I am the warning you refuse to hear until it's too late. I'm a 67-year-old lighthouse built on the jagged rocks of my own $120,000 shipwreck, flashing a desperate red light to keep you from steering into these same beautiful, lethal waters. If you are sitting in your quiet suburban home right now, dreaming of a captain's life in the Philippines, let me ask you one thing. Are you prepared to be a ghost in your own story? You think your money buys loyalty, but it actually buys an expiration date. Once the boat is in her name, you aren't a partner. You are a temporary obstacle to her prosperity. Let me give you the hard truth I paid for with my life's blood. Never put an asset in a name that isn't yours to prove a love that should be proven with time, not titles. You must understand the paper ghost protocol. If you don't exist on the deed, you don't exist in the law, and your undying trust is just a legal suicide note. Beware the secret cousin tax, where you subsidize your own replacement under the guise of family charity. Most importantly, remember the love property paradox. The larger the asset, the higher the incentive for them to exit you from the relationship. I am heading back to the cold silence of America now, carrying nothing but a backpack and a heart full of broken glass, returning to the waiting room for death I tried so hard to escape. I traded my security for a script where I was the hero, only to realize I was just the financier for someone else's movie. Don't let your provider ego trick you into burning your bridge for a mirage that vanishes when your bank account hits zero. Guard your retirement like the life raft it is. My light is fading, but I hope my wreckage serves as the map you use to navigate away from this sun-drenched grave.